Hi everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm Yardenne, and I'm going to read a small section of my novel. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background. This novel is about David, who escapes an oppressive and violent childhood in Philadelphia and moves to Israel. Later in the novel, he returns to meet the daughter of his ex-fiancée and is forced to deal with his past. However, this is an early section in the novel. David is 53 years old here, and his father, who is now an old man in Philadelphia, begins to suffer strokes. Both strokes were revealed to him by phone. He felt he was prepared for the first one, that he had been waiting for some sort of calamity to befall his father. Not expecting it, mind you, just patiently waiting for a moment of action, something that would push him into emotion. His father, in a moment of weakness, a prime opportunity to deal. So prime, in fact, that David had remained calm and collected throughout the ordeal, had become the voice of peace and reason that everyone depended on through hospitalization and home care. But the second stroke he was not expecting. He had done his part to deal with the big man's mortality, had thought he'd managed to escape, but the news of the second stroke sent him hiding in that rarely used corner of his Tel Aviv home, right by the guest bathroom, near the old-fashioned wooden desk that no one ever uses. Though his wife and son were out when the phone call came, this is where David chose to stand, his back turned on the rest of the house, and cry. His face was in his hands. A second stroke. The first one temporarily paralyzed the left side of his father's body. Who knows what the second one would do? David knew then that his dues have yet to be paid, and that he must go back to Philadelphia and help his parents out. When he arrived, he found his parents, Harold and Sylvia, sitting in the brown-hued den and staring at the TV. Harold looked at David. "Deva," he said, his lips twisting with the attempt to fight off the damage to his speech center. His father looked thin and almost paper white, his shrunken arms saggy and small, suddenly powerless. They spent a week at home. David helped his mother with cooking and errands and sat in the den with his dad to watch the Phillies play. The house hadn't changed much since David was a child. Still the ornate table lamps whose bodies looked like bathing Venuses. Still the liquor cabinet, bursting at the seams with crystal lowballs and metal stirrers, with fine vodkas and gins, displayed in the front for all to see but never opened, concealing behind them the cheap stuff that guests were actually served. And still the array of family photos, old and new, of all sizes, showing faces of all expressions, smiling and frowning at him from the hallway walls. There were plenty of pictures of him up there, as a chubby kid on his way to school, as an overweight teen riding a horse, as a college student, no longer carrying the extra weight but instead sporting a handlebar mustache, sitting on the porch with his mom, both of them in bell-bottoms, a few years before his trip to Israel, the trip that turned into a permanent reality. One evening in the den, David took his regular seat on the brown leather sofa, low enough to make him shorter than his father, who towered over him from his reclining chair in front of the television. Harold stared at the TV, the baseball players running and pitching and batting in front of him like a parade of life rushing in front of the eyes of the dying. Harold only taking parts of it in, the rest thrown away, going to waste. Harold's profile reminded David of a mummy's petrified portrait, the only sign of life gushing forth a thin line of drool, constantly running from the right corner of his mouth and unto the upper part of his chin. David leaned forward and grabbed a tissue from the box on the end table. Then, leaning further, he brought the tissue to his father's chin to wipe the drool off, and Harold, who didn't notice him approaching, surprised, seized David's arm with his fingers in one swift motion, his fingertips burrowing into David's sleeve, the death grip. David was 6 years old when he first experienced the power of the death grip, and this was not something easily forgotten. He was playing on the porch with a kid next door, Charlie, tossing around a football, and one of them, it was David, tossed it crooked, and it went straight into his front door, cracking the tiny window, the one he used to peek through like a sentinel every time he heard his father's car approaching the house at the end of the day. This time it was his father's face looking out the broken glass before opening the door and stepping outside. "I'm sorry, Dr. Orbach," Charlie said immediately. "It was my fault." Harold looked at the child in silence for a moment, then looked over at David's questioning eyes. "No need to defend David, Charlie," he said. "He can handle this on his own." But how did he know? He took David by the arm and led him back toward the front door. "Go home, Charlie," he said, and in an instant his fingers were locked around David's pudgy arm, the strong, thin white fingers leaving red marks on his skin. A sudden force, silent and unflinching, the death grip, the beginning of something. David had gotten a slap on the ass from his father before, been locked in his room without dinner, but that day, those fingernails digging into him, and the glint in his father's eye as he muttered a new word under his breath, shitface. These told him that he was now old enough, or that he had slowly been pecking at his father's patience for the past 6 years until the surface had finally cracked, and that punishment, real, honest-to-God punishment, had finally arrived. David and Harold stepped into the house, and Harold quietly closed the door behind them. David waited, unmoving, for his father to take action, and Harold did, walking slowly toward the stairs that led up to the bedroom. David breathed and began to follow, a step behind his father, thinking of the Mr. Potato Head waiting for him in his room, when Harold suddenly turned around and punched David square in the nose. A moment of stillness followed, David standing motionless, his hand not even flying to his face to make sure it was still there. Harold looked at him for a second before turning around and climbing up the stairs. David remained in his place, trying to slow down the rhythm of his breaths and pushing down tears. I will not cry. I will not cry. I will not be a pussy. But with each recurrence of the mantra, his eyes got warmer and moister. He pinched the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, pushing hard like he saw his grandfather do at his grandmother's funeral. This is how men don't cry. It's how they stay men. But he could feel the tips of his fingers becoming wet. He managed to stay calm until his mother appeared at the top of the stairs. "Mommy!" he broke into a wail. Mommy was there and would make it all right. She hurried down the stairs and put her hand on his face, checking the bruise. "What did you do?" she asked softly. This wasn't right. This wasn't the question she was meant to ask. Her eyes ran over his face, examining the damage done, not meeting his gaze. Finally he answered, "I broke the window and the door." Sylvia glanced up towards the door and frowned. She turned her eyes back to him. "Well," she ran her finger lightly over the bruise, "there's no bleeding." Then she finally looked into his eyes and said, "Don't upset your father." She turned around and went up the stairs to her room. Now, his elderly father's fingers wrapped around his arm, David once again couldn't move. It would have been easy to escape that grip, surprisingly strong though it was. But David didn't even try. Instead, he tried not to breathe, playing dead while this old dog sniffed him out. He didn't take his eyes off his father's face, but from the corner of his eye, he thought he saw his mother's silhouette approaching the den and then freezing and silently moving away. Then his father spoke. "Deva," he said. "Deva." "Yes, Dad," David croaked. "I was a shitty father." And David watched, amazed, as tears filled the old man's eyes and easily, simply rolled down his cheeks. "I was bad," Harold sobbed. "Okay, Dad, okay," David said, gently wiggling his arm free from his father's grip and finally touching the tissue to his face. Harold held still as David cleaned up the tears and the drool. Tissue after tissue, David kept wiping until his father's eyes closed and a light snore emanated from his nose. Then David quietly got up and went out to the porch, closing the front door gently behind him, and taking a quick look at the small window in the door that had since been replaced with a thicker, opaque glass. He lit a cigarette and looked through windows as families cooked in their kitchens and watched the news in their living rooms. Charlie's parents had moved out of the house next door a few years ago, off to assisted living in Florida, and David watched as a middle-aged woman came up the stairs to their old house, carrying groceries. "You must be Sylvia's son," she said. "Yes," he answered, "I'm David." "Nice to meet you, David. I'm Margaret. Did you grow up in this house?" "Yes, I did." He didn't know why he smiled at this, a proud, idiotic smile. "Oh, bless your heart. Well, have a good evening, David. You too, take care." Margaret walked in, the stairs creaking under her footsteps and the door banging lightly behind her. David leaned forward and put out his cigarette on the vertical face of the step below him. He chucked the butt through the crack between the steps and then from the corner of his eye saw the ground below, underneath the steps. The brown dirt was covered in cigarette butts in varying stages of decay. He couldn't identify each and every brand, but the shapes and hues told the story of years upon years of people, his mother and himself, sitting on the stoop, smoking, waiting out whatever was going on inside that needed to be waited out. He walked back inside to help his mother with dinner. Thank you.